Ruth Calloway pressed her dead daughter's brass button so hard into her palm that it left a circle of white skin. She didn't feel it. She was already walking through the gate of Hargrove's Crossing with her chin up, and her grief folded so far down inside her chest that even she couldn't find it anymore. She needed this job. She needed to keep moving, because the moment she stopped, Lucy would be there, and Ruth Calloway was not ready for that. Not yet. Maybe not ever. If this story already has your heart, please subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The summer of 1886 came to Red Bluff County like a man who didn't apologize for taking up space. The heat had been punishing since early June, and by the first week of August, it had settled into something almost personal, the kind of heat that made people say ugly things to each other and then not remember why. The creek that ran along the south boundary of Hargrove's Crossing was still running, which was more than most properties in the county could claim. And that single fact had made Eli Hargrove either the luckiest man in Red Bluff or the most dangerous, depending on who you asked and what they wanted from him. Ruth Calloway didn't know any of that when she stepped off the stage in the town of Caldwell Wells on a Wednesday afternoon. She knew the heat. She knew the dust. She knew the way strangers in small western towns looked at a woman traveling alone, that particular slow assessment that started at the hem of your dress and worked its way up to your face with no particular hurry. She had learned in the 14 months since her life had come apart in eastern Tennessee to simply let people look. Looking cost nothing. It changed nothing. She was still standing when they finished. She was 31 years old. She carried one bag. Inside it, 2 changes of clothing, a volume of McGuffey's Reader. She had never managed to leave behind a small tin of dried lavender that had been her mother's, and a brass button the size of a thumbnail that had come from the collar of a yellow dress, belonging to a little girl named Lucy, who had lived 2 years, 8 months, and 4 days before the fever took her on a cold October morning with the rain coming down outside, and Ruth holding her and not being able to do one single thing that mattered. She did not think about Lucy. She had made a rule about that. She thought about the job. The job had come to her through a woman at the way station in Abilene, a practical, square-faced woman named Hazel, who had delivered information the way a doctor delivers a diagnosis, plainly without softening it. "Rancher north of Caldwell Wells," Hazel had said. "Name's Hargrove. Lost his wife 2 years back. Got 2 children. Place is going sideways. He's paying $12 a month for someone willing to work hard and not cause trouble." Ruth had asked 2 questions. Is he dangerous? And is the work real? Hazel had said no and yes in that order. Ruth had gotten on the next stage. She wasn't afraid of work. Work was the only thing that had kept her vertical since Tennessee. Work meant her hands were occupied. Work meant the hours passed. She had cleaned houses, helped in a kitchen, spent 3 weeks as a seamstress's assistant in a town called Mercy, where nobody was. She had kept moving because stillness was the enemy. In stillness, Lucy was right there, small and warm and gone, and the weight of that was something Ruth had decided she could not carry and function at the same time. So she didn't carry it. She moved instead. West, always west, because west was where the country ran out of past. Caldwell Wells was not much of a town. Main Street, a church with peeling paint, a dry goods store, a saloon that was already making noise at 3 in the afternoon, a barber shop, a livery stable. The kind of town that had arrived somewhere between ambition and resignation and set up camp. Ruth walked the length of it with her bag in her hand and went directly to the livery. The man inside was old and sun-cracked and introduced himself as Gus. He looked at her the way Bert had looked at Clara Walker 2 counties over, with the careful assessment of a man who has seen enough of the world to recognize when a woman is in some particular kind of trouble she isn't going to talk about. "You the one going out to Hargrove's Crossing?" he said. "I am," Ruth said. Gus scratched the back of his hand. "You heard much about the place?" "I heard he needs help." Gus was quiet for a moment. He turned and started checking the harness on a roan mare, like the mare had asked him a question. He ain't easy, Gus said finally to the mayor apparently. Eli Hargrove ain't a mean man, I want to be clear on that, but he's been somewhere else for 2 years. Since Margaret passed. Something in him just... Gus made a gesture with one hand that described something leaving. He goes through help like he goes through gloves. 3 women have come and gone since spring. Why'd they leave? 2 left because the boy's difficult. Gus paused. 3rd one that was a different situation. Ruth waited. Cornelius Vane, Gus said. The name landed in the air differently from the other words. Heavier. Vane's been wanting that land for 2 years. He's got plans for a railroad spur through the south section. He started talking. Town started listening. Woman couldn't take the look she was getting every time she came in for supplies. He finally looked at Ruth directly. I'm telling you so you know what you're walking into, ma'am. Not to talk you out of it. I appreciate that, Ruth said. Can you get me a ride out? Gus could. Old Silas was heading that way with a supply wagon. Ruth sat on the bench outside and put her bag between her feet and pressed the button in her skirt pocket and watched the town exist around her and thought about nothing at all with the concentrated discipline of a woman who has practiced the art of thinking about nothing until she had gotten very good at it. The ride was 4 miles of flat-baked Texas ground that stretched out golden and relentless in every direction. Silas talked about the drought. Ruth said yes, and I see, and that's something, and watched the land, and when the ranch came into view, her first thought was that it had been a fine place once. The house was 2-story solid, well-positioned against the wind from the north. The barn was large. The fencing was good. But there was a quality to the whole property that she recognized immediately because she had seen it in herself, the look of something that had stopped trying. The front porch railing sagged. The garden along the south side of the house was mostly dead, a few brave things still coming up through the dry soil, like they hadn't gotten the news. A child's boot sat on the porch step, solitary and muddy, as if whatever child it belonged to had simply evaporated on the way inside. Silas let her down at the gate and drove off with a nod that contained everything he probably would have said if he'd been a man who spoke more. Ruth walked to the front door and knocked. Boots on wood. Heavy, deliberate, a man who moved like he owned every inch of floor beneath him. The door opened. Eli Hargrove was tall in the way of a man who had spent his life outdoors and had simply grown into the space the sky provided. Dark hair going gray at the temples. Dark eyes that looked at her, the way you look at weather you can't yet name. Not cold exactly. Not warm. Somewhere in the territory between those two things, where a man goes when warmth has gotten him in trouble before. He looked at her for a long moment. Mrs. Calloway, he said. Mr. Hargrove. You're younger than I expected. The work won't care, Ruth said. Something moved in his jaw. Not quite a reaction. The beginnings of one that he shut down before it arrived. He stepped back from the door. Come in. The inside was cleaner than she'd expected. Not clean, but not abandoned. Someone was trying. The floors had been swept recently. The dishes were done, though they sat in a haphazard stack that suggested doing them had been a project rather than a habit. There were children's drawings pinned to the wall near the kitchen doorway, and Ruth's eyes went to them briefly. Horses, mostly lopsided and earnest, before she pulled her attention back to the man leading her through the house. What I need, Eli said, moving into the kitchen without turning around, is someone who can manage the house. Meals, cleaning the garden if it's not too far gone. My foreman's got 2 men working the land. Nobody's working the house. He stopped at the kitchen table and turned. I've got 2 children. Caleb is 10. Nora is 7. Caleb is going to give you trouble. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. What kind of trouble? Eli's jaw worked. He's angry, he said. Has been since his mother died. He doesn't talk about it. He just acts it out. He folded his arms across his chest. The last woman who came, he put a dead snake in her hat box. She was gone by morning. Ruth looked at him evenly. What kind of snake? Eli blinked. A rat snake.
This story was
Harmless.
posted on the channel The Rusty
Then it was
Saddle.
a message,
Please
not a
do
threat,
not repost
Ruth
it in
said.
any form.
There's a difference. Eli stared at her for a moment with the particular expression of a man who has not expected to be surprised and has just been surprised. Then he unfolded his arms. $12 a month, he said. Room and board included. You do the work, it goes up. I'll do the work. I need to know you're going to stay, he said. He said it the way a man says the thing that cost him something to say flat careful, stripped down to just the facts of it. The children have had 3 women come through this house since Margaret died. Every single one of them left. I need your word that you're not going to do that to them. Ruth held his gaze. He looked like a man who had stopped believing in words a while back but was asking for them anyway because he had run out of other options. I'm not going anywhere, she said. You say that now. I say it because I mean it. I don't have anywhere else to be, Mr. Hargrove. This job suits me. I'll stay as long as you need me. She paused. I'd like to meet the children. He nodded once, sharp, the nod of a man who has decided something he isn't entirely sure about. They're out back. Nora's in the garden, what's left of it. Caleb is... He stopped. Caleb is wherever Caleb decides to be. The room he showed her was small. A single window facing the yard, a narrow bed, a washstand, a hook on the wall. Ruth set her bag on the bed and looked around at the bare economy of it. It was more than she'd had in 2 of the last 8 towns. It ain't much, Eli said from the doorway. His voice had tightened with something that might have been embarrassment if he'd been a man who let himself feel embarrassed. It's enough, Ruth said. Thank you. He left. She heard his boots, then the back door, then nothing. She sat down on the edge of the bed and put both hands flat on her thighs. She breathed once slowly the way she'd learned to breathe when things pressed in too close. Then she stood up and went to find the children. She found Nora first. The little girl was in the dead garden, crouched down in the dirt, examining something with a concentration that belonged to scientists and children in equal measure. She was small for 7, dark-haired, serious-faced, with Margaret's eyes. Ruth would know this later, set in a face that was already practicing the expression of someone who was trying very hard not to want too much. When Nora heard Ruth's footstep, she stood up immediately, stood straight, put her hands together in front of her, the posture of a child who had learned that the first impression mattered because she never knew how many impressions she would get. Hello, Ruth said. Hello, ma'am, Nora said. Very correct, very careful. I'm Ruth. I work here now. Nora studied her with the serious appraisal that only 7-year-olds can fully commit to. The others didn't stay, she said. I know, Ruth said. Are you going to stay? Ruth crouched down to her level. She looked at the little girl directly the way she'd looked at her students back in Tennessee when they'd asked her something that deserved a real answer. That's what I'm planning, she said. Nora considered this. She looked at the dirt. Mama had a garden, she said. I've been trying to water it, but I don't know what I'm doing right. I can teach you, Ruth said. Nora looked up. Something moved in her face, careful and hopeful in equal measure, the expression of a child reaching for something she isn't sure she's allowed to want. Okay, she said quietly. What's your name? Ruth asked, though she already knew. Nora. Nora, Ruth repeated. I'm very glad to meet you. Caleb found her 10 minutes later, which meant he'd been watching from somewhere and had made a decision about timing. He came around the corner of the barn with his hands in his pockets and his chin forward in the particular way of a boy who has decided in advance that he doesn't like what he's about to encounter. He was tall for 10 with Eli's coloring and a scowl that sat on his face like it had unpacked and planned to stay a while. He stopped about 6 feet from Ruth and looked at her the way you'd look at an unexpected fence post. You're the new one, he said. I am, Ruth said. You must be Caleb. Who told you that? Your father. Ruth did not move toward him and did not move away. She stood where she was and let him have the distance. He told me you're good with horses. Caleb's chin came down a fraction. He hadn't expected that. He said you knew the land better than the hands he's got working it. That wasn't precisely what Eli had said, but it was the kind of thing that was probably true. And Ruth had learned in 3 years of teaching that the best thing you could do with a defensive child was hand them something they hadn't thought to defend against. Caleb was quiet for a moment. He was recalculating. She could see it going back over his plans for this interaction and finding they no longer entirely applied. "The last woman who came put my snake outside in the cold," he said finally. "I heard about the snake," Ruth said. "I would have put it in a better box with some ventilation. A rat snake that size needs air circulation." Caleb stared at her. He blinked once. "You know about rat snakes." "I grew up in Tennessee. We had plenty." A silence. Caleb shifted his weight. His scowl had not fully left his face, but it had lost some of its certainty, the way a storm cloud loses definition when the wind shifts. "The hat box was real close to a heat vent," he said. "She wasn't supposed to leave it there." "Well," Ruth said, "you might want to consider that she didn't know about heat vents." Caleb opened his mouth, closed it, and then looked away toward the barn, as if the barn had said something that required his attention. When he looked back, the scowl had settled into something more neutral. "I'm not going to apologize," he said. "I haven't asked you to." Another silence. Caleb put his hands back in his pockets. He looked at her with the focused, analytical gaze of a boy who was used to trusting his own assessments and was finding that this particular assessment was taking longer than usual. "You're different from the others," he said. Not warmly, not even as a compliment, just as an observation delivered to the air between them. "I reckon I am," Ruth said. Caleb looked at her once more. Then he turned and walked back toward the barn with the deliberate, unhurried stride of a boy who was not running away from anything. He was simply done with this particular conversation for now. Ruth stood in the sun and allowed herself exactly 2 seconds of something that felt like hope, which she immediately filed away under things she was not going to examine too closely just yet. Dinner that night was mostly quiet. Eli sat at the head of the table with the focused blankness of a man eating for fuel rather than pleasure. Nora ate with small, careful bites and said, "Please and thank you" at the appropriate moments with a solemnity that was both touching and faintly heartbreaking. Caleb ate fast and kept his eyes on his plate, except for the 2 times he glanced at Ruth with that same measuring look, checking whether she was still different from his working theory of her. Ruth had made what she could from what the pantry offered: beans with salt pork biscuits, a pot of coffee so strong it practically had opinions. It was not a remarkable meal. It was warm, and it was ready when people needed it, and it had been made with the specific attention of someone who understood that food was not always about food. "These biscuits are good," Nora announced with the gravity of a food critic. "Thank you, Nora." Caleb said nothing, but he took a second biscuit when he thought nobody was watching. Ruth watched and said nothing. Eli said nothing either, but she caught his eyes moving briefly to his son's plate, and then away, and something in his face shifted for just a second before he shut it back down. After supper, Eli went out to check on the horses. Ruth cleaned the kitchen and listened to the children move around upstairs. She heard Caleb's voice, low and authoritative, and Nora's reply, and then a sound that might have been a small argument about something that did not matter, and might have been something else entirely. She didn't go up. That would come. Not yet. She was finishing the dishes when Eli came back in. He stopped when he saw her still at the basin. "You don't have to do that tonight," he said. "I don't mind," Ruth said. "It's better done fresh." He stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment without saying anything, which she was already beginning to understand was one of his primary modes of communication. The space between what Eli Hargrove said and what he meant was a significant territory, and she suspected she was going to need a map. "Caleb didn't throw anything," Eli said finally. "No," Ruth agreed. "He considered that." That's unusual." "He seems like a boy who needs to be taken seriously," Ruth said. She dried her hands on the kitchen towel. "He's been waiting for someone to take him seriously."
This story was
Eli
posted on
looked
the
at her in a
channel The
way that
Rusty
felt
Saddle.
different from the
Please do not
calculating weather
repost it in
assessment
any
of the
form.
afternoon. This was something more careful, more complicated. "Margaret used to say that," he said. His voice went flat on the name the way a voice does when it's carrying too much weight. He looked away. "Good night, Mrs. Calloway." "Good night, Mr. Hargrove." His boots on the floor, the sound of the back door, then quiet. Ruth stood in the kitchen in the low lamplight and listened to the house breathe around her, and thought about Margaret Hargrove, a woman she had never met, whose garden she was going to try to bring back to life, whose children she was going to try to keep whole, whose husband she was going to try carefully, cautiously, without plans or expectations, to remind how to function in the world of the living. She understood standing there exactly what kind of weight she had just agreed to pick up. She also understood that she was still standing. That after 14 months and every mile between Tennessee and this kitchen, she was still standing. And she pressed the brass button in her pocket and thought of Lucy, just for one breath, just allowed it. Just let the full shape of it exist in her chest for 1 second, and then she exhaled. She blew out the lamp. She went to her small room and lay down on the narrow bed in the dark. She had told Eli Hargrove she wasn't going anywhere. She was beginning to understand exactly what that promise was going to cost her. And she was beginning to understand quietly, in the specific dark of a ranch house in the Texas summer, that she might just be willing to pay it. The morning brought Cornelius Vane. She had not expected him on the second day, which told her either that he was a man who believed in moving quickly, or a man who had been watching and waiting, and simply decided that 2 days was enough to let her settle before he came to look her over. He arrived at 9 in the morning in a good suit and a hat that cost more than Ruth made in 3 months, riding a horse that had been brushed by someone who was paid specifically to brush it. He came to the front gate, and he waited there, which was the move of a man who understood that making others come to him was a form of authority. Ruth saw him from the kitchen window. She went to the front door. "Can I help you?" she said. Cornelius Vane looked at her. He was 50 or near it, with a soft face that had been handsome once, and had kept the confidence without keeping the looks. His eyes did the same thing the Caldwell Wells townspeople's eyes had done, that slow evaluation that began at the hem and moved upward, except that Vane's version had a different quality to it. More deliberate, more interested. "You must be the new arrangement," he said. Ruth held the door frame and looked at him pleasantly. "I'm the housekeeper," she said. "Ruth Calloway. Mr. Hargrove isn't here. He's on the south pasture." "I know where Eli is," Vane said. He tilted his head slightly, examining her with the look of a man who is cataloging information. "I'm Cornelius Vane. I expect you'll be hearing my name." "I expect I will," Ruth said. He smiled. It was a polished smile, the kind you learn from practice in rooms where smiling is a tool. "I'd advise you," he said pleasantly, "not to get too comfortable here, Mrs. Calloway. Mr. Hargrove's situation is unstable. It wouldn't be fair for you to invest yourself in a position that may not be standing come winter." Ruth looked at him for a long, level moment. She thought about 14 months. She thought about a stagecoach and an empty road and a brass button. She thought about the look on Nora's face when she'd said she could teach her about the garden. "I appreciate the advice," she said. "Is there a message you'd like me to pass to Mr. Hargrove?" Something moved in Vane's expression. A recalculation. He was a man accustomed to women who stepped back when he stepped forward, and she had not stepped back. He covered the recalculation quickly, but it was there. "Tell him I'll come by tomorrow," he said. "I have a business matter to discuss." He touched his hat, a minimal gesture, and turned his horse back toward the road. Ruth watched him go. She stood on the porch of Hargrove's Crossing in the August heat and felt something cold settle in her chest. Not fear exactly, but the specific alertness of a woman who has learned the hard way to pay close attention when a man smiles at her like he already knows how the story ends. She went back inside. She went back to the kitchen. She had bread to start, and a garden to assess, and 2 children who needed lunch. But she did not forget Cornelius Vane. And she did not even for a moment stop thinking about what he had meant by unstable. By evening, she knew. Because by evening, Dorothy McCready from the dry goods store had come to the gate while Eli was still out, and Dorothy McCready had the honest face of a woman who had decided to be useful and was going to be useful even if it was awkward. "I'm Dot," she said. "Don't let the welcome fool you, it ain't from everybody. I came because somebody ought to tell you what you're walking into before you hear it wrong from the wrong direction." Ruth opened the gate. "Come in," she said. Dot came in. She folded her hands, and she talked fast and straight the way a woman talks when she's decided the kindest thing she can do is not waste anyone's time. Vane wanted the south section for a railroad spur. He'd been working on it for 2 years. Eli had said no 3 times. So now Vane was working a different angle, building a story around the ranch, the struggling widower, the unstable household, the children with no real supervision, the string of women who'd come and gone. He was building a picture, Dot said, to take to the county judge, to challenge Eli's management of the property on grounds that a man who couldn't hold his household together couldn't be trusted to make sound decisions about a land dispute. "He's been waiting for someone to use," Dot said, "and now you're here." Ruth stood in the yard and felt the pieces arrange themselves in her mind with a cold, clicking precision. "He came this morning," she said. "Told me the situation was unstable. Suggested I shouldn't get comfortable." Dot's eyes sharpened. "He's starting already." "Yes," Ruth said. She looked out toward the south pasture. "Does Mr. Hargrove know how far Vane has taken this?" "He knows about the land claim," Dot said. "I don't think he knows about the picture Vane's been painting in town. About the household." She paused. "He's been a little elsewhere since Margaret passed. He handles the land. The rest of it he misses." Ruth nodded slowly. She thought about Eli in the kitchen doorway, flat and careful, and pulling himself back from the edge of every conversation. She thought about Caleb's scowl, and Nora's careful posture, and the dead garden, and the child's boot on the porch step. She thought about a man who had decided somewhere in the last 2 years that if he stayed very still and focused only on the physical work of running 400 acres, the rest of it might somehow sort itself out. It hadn't sorted itself out. It had gotten worse. And Cornelius Vane had been watching it get worse with the focused patience of a man who understood that a drowning person doesn't need to be pushed. You only need to wait. "Thank you," Ruth said to Dot. "Don't thank me," Dot said. "Stay." She adjusted her shawl with the brisk efficiency of a woman who has said what she came to say. "Eli Hargrove is a decent man underneath all that shutdown. Those children need someone who isn't going to run." She looked at Ruth directly. "You seem like you might be that someone." She left the way she came, quick and purposeful. Ruth stood in the yard alone. She pressed the button in her pocket. She looked at the dead garden and the sagging porch rail and the single boot on the step. She looked at the south pasture where she knew Eli was working, moving, doing, because stopping was the thing he could not do. She understood him, she realized. She understood him completely. Because she had been doing the exact same thing for 14 months. She went inside. She started supper. When Eli came in from the pasture an hour later, she was at the stove, and Nora was sitting at the kitchen table with a piece of paper drawing horses, and Caleb had come in through the back door without being asked, and was sitting in the chair nearest the window with his arms on his knees, not talking to anyone, but not leaving either. Eli stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at his children and then at Ruth, and something moved through his face that he controlled quickly and completely. "Supper in 20 minutes, Ruth said without turning around. He hung his hat, he washed his hands, he sat down at the table. And for the second night in a row at Hargrove's Crossing, something that had been missing from that kitchen arrived quietly and without announcement. Ruth kept her back to all of them, kept stirring, kept her face where nobody could read it. But her hand was steady, and the button in her pocket was warm from being held. And she was still here. Against every reasonable expectation, against everything the last 14 months had done to her idea of what she was allowed to want. She
This
was
story
still
was
here.
posted on the channel The
She
Rusty
hadn't planned
Saddle.
for that.
Please do not
She
repost
hadn't
it in any
planned for
form.
any of it. But Ruth Calloway was beginning to understand that some of the most important things a person does, they never plan at all. 3 days into her time at Hargrove's Crossing, Ruth understood two things with the kind of clarity that only comes from paying close attention. The first was that Caleb Hargrove had declared war. The second was that he was conducting it with the methodical patience of someone who had done this before and knew exactly how long it took to break a person. It started the morning after Macready's visit. Ruth went to the kitchen at first light and found the bread she'd set to rise the night before, thoroughly deflated, with a handprint pressed into the center of it, deliberate and unhurried. She looked at it for a moment. She started a second batch. She said nothing at breakfast. Caleb sat across from her with the serene expression of a boy who has never heard the word bread in his life. The following morning, her good kitchen apron, the one she'd paid for herself in Abilene, was missing from its hook. She found it 2 days later folded neatly on a fence post 50 yards from the house. She brought it in, shook the dust off, hung it back on the hook. Said nothing. Nora watched all of this with the careful sideways attention of a child who was keeping score on behalf of the universe. On the fourth morning, Ruth set breakfast on the table. Eggs, fried salt pork biscuits, and sat down across from both children. Eli had already gone out. The three of them were alone, and Ruth had decided that alone was the right condition for this particular conversation. "Caleb," she said pleasantly, "how long are you planning to keep this up?" He looked at her over the rim of his cup. "Keep what up?" "The campaign." Nora made a sound into her milk. Caleb set his cup down with great care. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. "The bread," Ruth said. "The apron. The bucket I found in the barn this morning with a hole punched through the bottom that wasn't there yesterday." She cut her biscuit in half. "I'm not angry. I'm asking how long you're planning to do it because I'd like to know what kind of timeline we're working with." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. He had his father's jaw and his father's way of going very still when he was thinking something through. "The other one's left," he said finally. His voice came out smaller than he intended. "I heard that." "All three of them." He looked at the table. "The last one lasted 11 days. How many days have I been here?" Caleb was quiet. He was counting. "4, he said. "Then you've got 7 days before you beat your record." Ruth took a bite of her biscuit. "Although I should tell you, I'm not planning on going anywhere, so you might want to adjust your strategy." Caleb looked up at her. He had Margaret's eyes. She had figured this out by the second day from the photograph on the parlor shelf. And in those eyes right now was something younger than 10, something that wanted very badly to believe her and had very good reasons not to. "You don't know that," he said. "You can't promise that." "You're right," Ruth said. "I can't promise what's coming. Nobody can. But I can tell you what I intend. And I intend to stay." She held his gaze steadily. "So, you can keep deflating my bread if you want to. I'll keep making more. We can do this as long as you need to." Caleb stared at her. Something moved behind his eyes, complicated and real, and fighting hard to stay hidden. He picked up his fork. He ate his eggs. He did not say anything else, but when he carried his plate to the basin after breakfast, he set it in the water instead of leaving it on the counter, which was not what he had done the 3 mornings before. Nora caught Ruth's eye across the table and gave her a look of such solemn significance that Ruth had to look away to keep from smiling. It wasn't peace. Ruth knew the difference between peace and a ceasefire, but a ceasefire was a start. Eli came in from the pasture that afternoon, asking for water with the brief economy of a man who has forgotten that asking for things is allowed. Ruth handed him a full cup without comment. He drank it, set it down, and stood at the kitchen table looking at nothing in particular. "Caleb behaved today?" he asked. "Fine," Ruth said. He glanced at her. He clearly did not believe her. "He deflated my bread this morning," she said. And he put a hole in the mop bucket. Other than that, perfectly fine. Eli's jaw tightened. He set his hat on the table. Clara, I'll talk to him. Don't, Ruth said. She turned from the stove. He's testing me. I'd rather he test me than shut down. At least when he's making mischief, he's still fighting. She paused. She yid. Nora worries me more. Eli went very still. Why? She's too careful, Ruth said. She says please and thank you at exactly the right moments, and she keeps her hands folded, and she watches every adult in this house the same way, like she's calculating the odds that they're going to disappear. Ruth looked at him directly. She's 7 years old. She shouldn't be calculating odds. Eli turned away. He put both hands flat on the kitchen counter and stood there with his back to her, and said nothing for long enough that the silence became a kind of answer. His shoulders were rigid. She waited him out. She had learned in 4 days that Eli Hargrove's silences were not empty. They were full of things he was deciding whether to say. Margaret used to say that about her, he said finally. Said Nora felt everything twice, but kept half of it locked away where nobody could find it. His voice had gone scraped and flat. Said she worried about that. Ruth kept her voice even. She was right to worry, but she was also right to love her for it. A beat. Nora's going to be fine, Mr. Hargrove. She just needs someone to stay long enough that she stops waiting for the leaving. Eli didn't turn around, but his hands relaxed against the counter. Just slightly. Just enough. Eli, he said. Ruth paused. My name, he said. It's Eli. Mr. Hargrove was my father, and he was not a man I care to be reminded of. He pushed off the counter and went to the door. Supper at 6. He walked out. Ruth stood in the kitchen with something in her chest that she wasn't going to examine too carefully, and thought about a man who had just told her in the most indirect possible way to use his first name. In the particular vocabulary of Eli Hargrove, she was beginning to understand that was the equivalent of a long speech. Cornelius Vane came back the next morning, as he'd said he would. This time, Eli was there to receive him, and Ruth stayed in the kitchen, because that was the appropriate place for the housekeeper, and also because she could hear everything from there if she didn't make noise. She heard Vane's voice smooth and reasonable, and carrying the particular warmth of a man who is doing something unpleasant with good manners. She heard him talk about the railroad spur, about the value of the south section, about what the land could be worth to a man who was willing to think long-term. She heard him use the phrase, difficult situation twice in reference to the ranch. She heard Eli say no. She heard Vane say the word reconsider with the careful weight of someone who is putting it down on a surface and making sure you understand it's going to stay there. She heard Eli say, I've reconsidered. The answer is still no. A pause. Then Vane's voice again, and something shifted in it just slightly, just enough. I've heard you've had some trouble keeping good help, Vane said. The children, the household. I'd hate to see a situation develop that drew the wrong kind of attention from the county. Another pause. Especially given the conversation I've been having with Judge Aldrich about water rights along the south boundary. A man's personal affairs tend to come into view when his property matters do. A long silence. Then Eli's voice quieter than before and much more dangerous. Get off my land, Cornelius. Eli! I said get off my land. Ruth heard Vane's boots on the porch, the sound of a horse being mounted, the deliberate pace of a man leaving on his own terms, even when he's been told to go. She heard Eli stand in the front room not moving for almost a full minute. Then his boots on the floor slow and even, and he came into the kitchen doorway and stood there. She looked at him. His face was the controlled face, the wall-up face, but underneath it, something was working hard and hot. He looked like a man who has just had something confirmed that he had been hoping was not true. He's been talking to Judge Aldrich, Ruth said. Eli's eyes came to her. You heard that? I wasn't trying to. He came to the table and sat down, which was the first time she had seen him sit down in the middle of the day. He put both elbows on the table and pressed his hands over his face for a moment, a gesture so unguarded that she felt she had seen something
This
she
story
wasn't
was
meant to
posted
see.
on the channel The
Then
Rusty
his hands
Saddle.
came
Please
down,
do not
and he looked
repost
at her
it in
with a
any form.
directness that was new. "Tell me what Dot told you," he said. Ruth sat down across from him. She told him all of it. Vane's 2 years of maneuvering the picture being built in town, the women who had left partly because of Caleb, and partly because of what people said every time they came in for supplies. She laid it out straight, the way Dot had laid it out to her, without softening and without editorializing. Eli listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a full 30 seconds. "He's using you," Eli said. "Using your being here." "Yes," Ruth said. "If you send me away, it won't fix that. It'll confirm it. Sending me away now looks like guilt." She held his gaze. "The only thing that changes this is you standing up in that town and saying plainly what I am here and what I am not." Something tightened in his expression. "And what are you here, Mrs. Calloway?" Ruth looked at him across the kitchen table in the full August heat and understood that the question was not what it sounded like on the surface. He was not asking for a job title. He was asking something harder, something that neither of them had any business asking or answering after 5 days. "I'm someone who isn't leaving," she said. "That's what I am. Whatever else we call it, that part is true." He held her gaze for a moment. Something moved in his expression, raw and real, and then it was gone, shut down with the practiced efficiency of a man who had been shutting things down for 2 years. He pushed back from the table. "I'll be at the south fence line," he said. He went. Ruth sat at the table and listened to his boots on the porch, and thought about a man who had asked her one real question and received one real answer, and had run from both of them. She understood that too. She had been doing the same thing for 14 months. The gossip came for her on a Tuesday. She had gone into Caldwell Wells with Eli's foreman, a weathered man named Frank, who communicated primarily through the angle of his hat brim to collect supplies. She moved through this dry goods store, quickly aware of the quality of the silence that fell when she came in, the particular silence that has a shape to it that comes from people stopping their conversations and deciding whether to resume them in front of you. She might have gotten through it if not for the 2 women near the fabric bolts. She didn't know their names yet, but she would. For now, she only knew their voices, which carried without any apparent effort. "That's her," the first one said. "The one Hargrove hired." "Lord, where'd he find her?" "Showed up on the stage from Abilene. No family, no references. Just walked up to his gate and he let her in." A pause full of eloquent implication. "With 2 children in that house," the second one said. "You'd think a man in his position would be more careful." Ruth set her items on the counter. The storekeeper, a lean man with kind eyes and a strong instinct for self-preservation, looked at the ceiling and said, "That'll be $1.40, ma'am," in a voice that was careful and neutral. "A woman like that," the first voice continued, "you never know what she's after." Ruth counted out her money. She picked up her purchases. She turned around. Both women went quiet with the sudden alertness of people who have just realized the subject of their conversation is standing 6 feet away and looking directly at them. "A woman like that," Ruth said pleasantly, "is after flour and salt pork and getting back to work before the bread rises too long." She looked at them for one level, unhurried moment. "Good morning." She walked out into the August heat and did not look back. Frank, waiting by the wagon, looked at her face and helped her load the supplies in silence. They were halfway back to the ranch before he said, without any particular inflection, "Town's always had a mouth on it, long as I can remember." "I know how towns are," Ruth said. Frank clicked to the horse. "Eli don't give a damn what they say, just so you know." Ruth looked at him. Frank kept his eyes on the road, which she had noticed was his way of saying things that mattered to him. "He lost Margaret in February of '84, Frank said. "Before that, those 2, they were solid. She kept him from being too much in his own head. Kept the whole operation human." A pause. "He ain't been right since. The land he can do. The rest of it? Frank shook his head once briefly. He wouldn't have hired you if he didn't think you could do it. Eli Hargrove don't do things he don't mean. I appreciate you telling me that, Ruth said. Just telling you what's true, Frank said, and clicked to the horse again, and they rode the rest of the way in the companionable silence of two people who have said what needed to be said and don't feel the need to keep talking on top of it. That evening, Ruth found the photograph. She had not been looking for it. She had been searching the linen closet for an extra blanket. Because the previous night had turned cold in the abrupt way of Texas summers, and Nora had woken shivering, and Ruth had gone to the wrong shelf in the wrong closet, and found instead a small framed photograph face down on the top shelf, turned to the wall, as if it had been placed there deliberately out of sight, but not removed entirely. She turned it over. Margaret Hargrove looked back at her. Dark hair, Nora's eyes, a mouth that looked like it had been laughing just before whoever held the camera had said, "Hold still." She was standing in the garden. Ruth recognized the garden, or what it had been before it died, and she had the easy, unself-conscious posture of a woman who was entirely at home in her own life. Ruth stood in the hall and looked at the photograph for a long moment. She thought about Eleanor's boxes on a shelf in another story, another ranch, another family. No. She thought about Margaret specifically. Margaret, this specific woman who had planted that garden and raised those children and loved that impossible shut-down man, and had died in February and left all of it behind without choosing to. She put the photograph back face down exactly the way she'd found it. She closed the closet. She got the blanket from the right shelf. She went and tucked it around Nora without waking her, and stood for a moment in the doorway of the children's room, watching both of them sleep. Caleb on his back arms, flung wide, taking up the full territory of his half of the room. Nora curled small and careful on her side, even in sleep somehow managing not to occupy too much space. Ruth pressed the button in her pocket and felt something turn over in her chest, that familiar ache that hurt and felt like warmth. At the same time, those two things so tangled, she had stopped being able to separate them. She became aware of Eli in the doorway behind her. She had not heard him come up the stairs, which meant either she was losing her edge or he moved more quietly than she'd given him credit for. She looked over her shoulder. He was standing in the hall, fully dressed, looking at his children with the expression he allowed himself only when he thought nobody was watching. Open. Unprotected. The expression of a man who loved people so much it frightened him. His eyes moved from the children to Ruth. She looked back at him. Neither of them spoke. After a moment, he stepped back from the doorway. She heard him move quietly down the hall. She heard his door open and close. Ruth exhaled slowly. She looked at Caleb's sprawled, careless sleep, at Nora's small, tucked stillness. She stood there longer than she needed to. Then she went back downstairs to her small room and lay down on the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling and thought about what Dot had said. Stay. And what Eli had said, or rather, had not said, standing in that doorway with his face open for the 2 seconds he'd allowed himself. And what Caleb had said across the breakfast table, his voice going small and real. You can't promise that. She pressed the button flat against her palm. Lucy had been 2 years old and 4 days old. She had smelled of baby powder and the particular sweetness that belonged only to that particular child. She had said mama with the full conviction of someone for whom that word meant everything in the world. She had died on a cold October morning with the rain coming down, and Ruth had held her until she was cold. And then she had put her in the ground, and then she had kept moving, because moving was the only honest response she had left. She thought about all of that. She let herself think about it lying in the dark in someone else's house, with the button in her hand, and the sound of Texas wind against the window. She let it be real for 1 full minute, the whole weight of it. May Lucy. Lucy and the winter and Thomas and the empty house and every mile she'd put between herself and the woman she'd been before she started running. Then she exhaled. She folded her hands over the button on her chest and looked at the ceiling. She had told Eli Hargrove she wasn't going anywhere. She had told Caleb she intended to stay. She had looked Nora in the eyes and said, That's what I'm planning, with the full sincerity of someone who meant it and was not entirely sure yet what meaning it was going to ask of her. She was beginning to find out. Tomorrow, Cornelius Vane would make his next move. She didn't know what shape it would take, but she knew it was coming the way you know weather is coming when the horses get restless. She knew the town's opinion of her was something that could be used against Eli in ways that went beyond social discomfort. She knew there was a judge named Aldrich who had been having conversations that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with land. And she knew that somewhere in the house above her, a 10-year-old boy was sleeping with his arms flung wide, still fighting even in his dreams, and a 7-year-old girl was curled small and careful, still waiting for the next thing to be taken away. Ruth Calloway pressed the button in her palm and felt the edge of it sharp and small.
This story was posted
and real.
on the channel The
She was
Rusty
still
Saddle.
here,
Please
and
do not
tomorrow,
repost
she was
it
going
in
to
any
have to
form.
decide exactly what that meant. The next move came not from Vane, but from the town, which was in some ways worse, because a town has no face to look at and no single door to shut. Ruth went into Caldwell Wells on a Thursday with Frank and came back with more than supplies. She came back with the specific knowledge that Hattie Greer, who ran the Ladies' Auxiliary and had the social force of a natural disaster in a good dress, had spent the previous Sunday telling anyone who would hold still long enough that Eli Hargrove's household was a scandal waiting to be documented, that the children were being raised without proper moral supervision, that a widow of unknown character living under the same roof as a widower was exactly the kind of thing that decent communities had an obligation to address. Dot told her at the counter fast and low while Frank was loading the wagon. She went to Reverend Birch already, Dot said. He's a good man, but he's got the spine of a wet newspaper when Hattie gets going. I'd expect a visit. When? Ruth said. End of the week probably. Hattie doesn't like to wait. Ruth nodded. She picked up her parcels. Thank you, Dot. Don't thank me, Dot said, same as before. Just don't run. Ruth didn't run. She went back to the ranch and made supper and helped Nora practice her letters and listened to Caleb tell a long, winding story about a hawk he'd seen on the south fence line with the specific authority of a boy who has decided the person he's talking to is worth telling things to. He hadn't announced this decision. He'd simply started talking, and Ruth had simply started listening, and the distance between them had shifted another fraction of an inch in the direction of something better. Eli watched this from the head of the table with his careful, controlled face. But his eyes were doing something different from his face, and Ruth had learned by now to read the difference. After supper, after the children were upstairs, she told him about Hattie Greer and Reverend Birch. She told him straight the way she'd told him about Vane, without softening. He listened with his hands flat on the table and his jaw set, and that particular stillness that meant he was absorbing something he didn't like. Vane planted it, he said. It was not a question. Almost certainly, Ruth said. Hattie Greer thinks she's acting on principle. She doesn't know she's acting on his schedule. Eli was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I should send you away, before it gets worse. We've had this conversation, Ruth said. I know. Then you know why that's the wrong move. He looked at her. What's the right one? Ruth folded her hands on the table. When Reverend Birch comes, you talk to him. You're here, you're present, you answer his questions directly, and you don't apologize for a single thing you've done right. She paused. And you stop disappearing into the south pasture every time something in this house requires you to feel something. The silence that followed that was the kind that has weight. Eli looked at the table. He looked at his hands. He looked at the lamp. He looked everywhere except at her, and she let him, because she understood that some truths needed a moment to settle before a person could look at them directly. I hear you, he said finally. His voice was rough at the edges. He pushed back from the table and went to bed without another word. Ruth sat in the kitchen alone and thought that hearing was a start. Reverend Birch came on a Friday afternoon, which meant Hattie Greer had not wanted to wait until the end of the week after all. Ruth saw him coming up the road from the kitchen window. A thin, careful man in a good coat, moving with the uncomfortable deliberateness of someone who has been asked to do something he isn't entirely sure is right. Behind him, at a distance calculated to look uninvolved, Hattie Greer walked with two women from the auxiliary, their postures carrying the rigid certainty of people who have decided they are on the side of virtue and intend to remain there regardless of what they find. Eli was in the house. Ruth had asked him that morning to stay close. He had not asked why. He had stayed. Ruth went to the front door and opened it before Reverend Birch could knock. "Reverend," she said, "would you like to come in?" He looked relieved that she had opened the door, which told her something about what he'd been prepared for. "Mrs. Calloway." He removed his hat. "I wonder if I might speak with Mr. Hargrove." "He's here," Ruth said. She stepped back from the door. "Please come in." She did not look at the women on the walk. She did not invite them, and they did not push it, though she could feel Hattie Greer's attention on her back, like a hand pressing between her shoulder blades. Eli was in the front room. He stood when the Reverend came in and he shook the man's hand and he said, "Reverend Birch, sit down." The directness of it, the simplicity, seemed to steady the Reverend somewhat. He sat. Ruth sat across from him. Eli remained standing, which in the language of Eli Hargrove was its own kind of statement. "There is concern," Reverend Birch began carefully, "in the community, about the nature of the arrangement here. You are a widower. Mrs. Calloway is a widow. There are young children. There are," Eli said, "who were being raised without adequate help for 2 years, which I imagine concerned nobody." Reverend Birch blinked. My children needed someone to care for them," Eli said. "I hired Mrs. Calloway because she was capable and because she was willing to stay, which is more than I can say for the 3 women who came before her." He folded his arms across his chest. "She has been in this house for 8 days. In those 8 days, my son has stopped treating the household like a battlefield, and my daughter has started sleeping through the night. That is what is happening in this house, Reverend. I'd like to know which part of it concerns you." Reverend Birch opened his mouth and then closed it. He looked at Ruth, who was sitting with her hands folded and her face composed and her eyes steady. "The concern," the Reverend tried again, "is one of appearances. Reverend," Ruth said, her voice quiet but clear, "I have cooked every meal in this house for 8 days. I have mended 3 pairs of trousers, replanted half a kitchen garden, and sat up 2 nights running with a child who couldn't sleep because she missed her mother. I have done nothing, not one single thing that any decent woman in this community would not do in my position." She paused. "I'd like you to ask yourself who benefits if I leave this house. Who has something to gain if Eli Hargrove looks like a man who can't keep order? Who sent those women out there?" She did not gesture toward the walk, did not need to stand where they could see whatever happened here today. Reverend Birch was quiet. Something was moving behind his eyes, rearrangement pieces shifting into a configuration he hadn't expected when he walked up that road. He looked at Eli, who was still standing with his arms folded and his face giving nothing away except the absolute certainty of a man who has decided to stop being pushed. "Vain," the Reverend said slowly. "Not a question. A man putting something together." "He's been working at this for 2 years, Ruth said. "The land claim is the main event. We're the supporting story. It's easier to challenge a man's judgment about his property if you've already established that his judgment about his household is questionable." She held the Reverend's gaze. "You're not a bad man, Reverend. I don't think you came here with bad intentions, but I think you ought to know whose intentions you've been acting on." Reverend Birch set his hat on his knee. He looked at it. He looked like a man who had come in one door and discovered the room was not the room he'd thought it was. "I was not aware," he said carefully, "of the full dimension of the situation." "Most people aren't," Ruth said. "Cornelius Vane is very good at keeping the dimensions separate." The Reverend stood. He put his hat back on. He looked at Ruth with something close to respect and a fair amount of chagrin, which she thought was an honest combination for the circumstances. "I'll speak to Hattie," he said. "I'd appreciate that," Ruth said. "And Reverend, tell her the children are fine. in case she was actually worried rather than just useful. He left. Ruth watched through the window as he spoke to the women outside. She couldn't hear the words, but she could read the conversation from Hattie Greer's posture alone. The stiffening, the visible protest, the particular stillness of a woman being told something that requires her to revise a position.
This story
she
was
has held
posted on the
publicly
channel The
and with
Rusty
conviction.
Saddle. Please do not
The group
repost it
dispersed
in any
slowly
form.
and without happiness. Ruth exhaled. Behind her, Eli said, "That was well done." She turned. He was looking at her with an expression that was not the controlled face, not entirely. Something had gotten through the wall, something that looked like it had been there for a while and had finally found a gap. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "You could have let me handle it." "You handled the part that needed you," Ruth said. "I handled the part that needed me." He looked at her for a moment. Then he went out to the pasture, because that was what he did when something moved in him that he didn't know what to do with, but his boots on the porch had a different sound than usual. Less like a door closing. More like something being set down. It was Nora who found the letter. She came to Ruth on a Saturday afternoon with a piece of paper held in both hands, the way children carry things they understand to be important, without knowing exactly why. She had been in the room off the upstairs hall, the one Ruth had not opened. The one she'd understood from the beginning was the room where Margaret's things were kept, boxes packed and labeled and not yet gone anywhere. "I was looking for Mama's other photograph," Nora said. Her voice was very careful. "The one where she's laughing. Papa has the serious one on the shelf, but I wanted the laughing one, and I thought maybe it was in the boxes." She held out the paper. "I found this instead. I think it's important. I don't know why, but I think it is." Ruth took the paper. She unfolded it. It was a letter in Margaret's handwriting. She recognized it from the labels on the boxes in that room, neat and slightly forward-leaning, dated the spring of 1883. 3 years ago, the year after the children were born. She read it once quickly, and then again slowly. Then she sat down on the nearest chair, because her legs had made a decision without consulting her. Margaret had written to a man named Aldrich. Not Judge Aldrich, his brother, a land surveyor who had been hired by Gerald Vane Cornelius's father to document the south boundary of Hargrove's Crossing in 1881. Margaret had found the original survey record in a box of Eli's papers while organizing the office. She had written to the surveyor's brother because the surveyor himself had died asking whether Gerald Vane had ever formally purchased or legally claimed any portion of the south boundary that included the creek. The reply attached to the letter in a different hand was brief and absolute. Gerald Vane had inquired about purchasing the water rights in 1880 and had been refused. No transaction had occurred. No deed had been signed. Whatever Cornelius Vane intended to claim in court, his father had never legally acquired what he was claiming to have passed down. The letter had never been sent anywhere. Or rather, it had been received filed, placed in a box with the reply attached, and there it had sat for 3 years while Margaret died and Eli shut down, and Cornelius Vane spent 2 years building a fraudulent claim on the assumption that nobody was looking closely enough at what his father had actually done. Ruth sat with the letter in her hands and felt her own heartbeat loud and specific in her ears. "Is it important?" Nora said. She was still standing in the doorway watching Ruth's face with those careful reading eyes. "Nora," Ruth said. Her voice came out strange, steady but strange. "Where's your father?" "South fence line. Frank said he'd be back by—" "Go get him," Ruth said. "Right now. Tell him I need him. Tell him it's important." Nora didn't ask questions. She turned and ran, which was the fastest Ruth had ever seen the little girl move. All that careful self-containment dissolved in the simple urgency of being needed, of having a job that mattered. Her feet on the stairs, the back door, then gone. Ruth sat with the letter, and waited and breathed, and did not let herself feel the full size of what she was holding, until she heard Eli's boots on the back porch faster than his usual pace, because Nora had clearly communicated the urgency in her own serious and efficient way. He came into the kitchen. He looked at Ruth's face. He crossed to the table without a word, and she held the letter out, and he took it. She watched him read it. She watched his face go through the same sequence she had learned to recognize: stillness, comprehension, and then something that was not quite the controlled face. Not this time. Something fiercer and more real, the expression of a man who has been fighting blind for 2 years and has just been handed light. "Where did this come from?" he said. "Nora found it. In Margaret's boxes. She was looking for the photograph." Ruth paused. "She was looking for the one where her mother is laughing." Something moved through Eli's face, at that sharp and private, and then he looked back at the letter. Margaret found the original survey record. He said more to himself than to Ruth. She wrote to Aldrich's brother. She documented the whole thing. He set the letter down. He put both hands flat on the table. She knew. 3 years ago she knew, and she put it in writing, and then she... He stopped. "She protected this ranch," Ruth said quietly. "Even then, even before Vane made his move, she was paying attention, and she protected it." Eli stood at the kitchen table and did not speak for a long time. His hands were flat on the table, and his jaw was working, and he had the expression of a man fighting a feeling he has not allowed himself in a long time, a feeling he has gotten very good at the mechanics of suppressing. Ruth sat across from him and let him have the silence. She did not reach for a word to fill it. Caleb appeared in the doorway. He had come in behind Eli without anyone noticing, and he stood there with his arms at his sides and his face doing the complicated arithmetic it did when he was trying to understand something adult-shaped. He looked at his father's face. He looked at the letter on the table. He looked at Ruth. "Is it bad?" he said. "No," Ruth said. "It's good. Your mother did something very important a long time ago, and we just found out about it." Caleb came into the kitchen fully. He sat down at the table the way he sat when something was serious without the usual performance of occupying space. He looked at the letter. He looked at his father. "Mama fixed it," he said. Eli looked at his son. Something in his face broke open and then came back together differently, the way a thing looks after it has cracked and been reset. He reached across the table and put his hand on the back of Caleb's neck, a rough, certain gesture, the way fathers touch sons when words won't do the work. "Yeah," he said. "Mama fixed it." Caleb was very still under his father's hand. He looked at the table. Then he said quietly, with none of his usual armoring, "I miss her." "I know," Eli said. "Me too." Nora had come back in somewhere during this and was standing near Ruth's chair, and without deciding to Ruth put her arm around the little girl, and Nora leaned into her side with the complete unself-conscious trust of a child who has stopped calculating whether she is allowed. She just leaned. Ruth held her. Eli looked at the two of them. His face was open in a way she had not seen before, not the gap in the wall, but the wall itself, gone temporarily. And what was underneath was grief and gratitude, and something else she did not yet have a name for. He looked at Nora, tucked against Ruth's side. He looked at the button-sized shape Ruth's hand made at the back of her pocket, pressed there by habit, and he didn't know what it meant. But he understood in some wordless way that it meant something, that Ruth Calloway was carrying something she had not put down. He looked at her directly. "I'm riding to Caldwell Wells tonight," he said. "To the telegraph office. I need to get this letter to my lawyer in Abilene before Vane hears it exists." "Go," Ruth said. "The children. Eli." She said his name with the gentle exasperation of someone who has already answered this question several times. "I will be here when you get back." He held her gaze for one moment, and what passed between them in that moment was not words, and not yet anything with a name, but it was real, and they both felt it, and neither of them looked away from it until he picked up the letter, folded it with the careful hands of a man handling something irreplaceable, and put it in his coat pocket. He stopped at the door. He did not turn around. "Thank you, Ruth," he said. She had not realized until that moment that he had never used her given name before. It landed differently than she had expected. Quieter, more specific, like something that had found the exact shape of the space it was meant to fill. The door closed behind him. Nora was still leaning against her side. Caleb was still at the table looking at the place where the letter had been.
This story was posted on the channel
His
The Rusty
face,
Saddle.
younger than
Please
10
do not
for once,
repost it
soft
in any
around
form.
the edges in the way of a child who has let something real in and is still deciding whether to regret it. She was smart, wasn't she? Caleb said. Caleb. Not quite a question. Your mother, Ruth said. Yes, she was paying attention when it mattered. Caleb looked at the table. He turned his cup in a slow circle, a gesture so much like his father's that Ruth felt something catch in her chest. People keep leaving, he said, very quietly, the armor entirely down. Ruth looked at him for a moment. Then she said, I know that's what it's felt like. The last one was here 11 days, he said. I counted. I know you did. He looked up at her. His dark eyes were steady and direct and very young. How many days is it now? He said. Ruth thought. 8, she said. Caleb nodded. He looked back at the table. He picked up his cup and drank the rest of his water. Then he stood, pushed his chair in with the particular deliberateness of a child who is doing the right thing on purpose, and said, I put a hole in the mop bucket. I know, Ruth said. I can fix it, he said. I know how. Ruth looked at him. He was looking at the floor, at the wall, at anything that wasn't her face, and his jaw was set with the effort of someone offering something real and being terrified of how it will be received. I'd appreciate that, she said. Thank you, Caleb. He nodded once, sharp his father's nod exactly, and went upstairs. Ruth listened to his feet on the stairs and felt something turn over in her chest that had been locked in a particular position for 14 months and had just without warning moved. Nora looked up at her. He never fixes things, she said, with the solemn authority of someone delivering significant intelligence. I know, Ruth said. That means he likes you, Nora said. Ruth pressed her lips together. She looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then she looked down at this small, serious girl, leaning against her side with her careful hands and her watching eyes, and said, You think so? Yes, Nora said with absolute certainty. He only fixes things for people he likes. He fixed Papa's bridle last winter, and he wouldn't fix the window latch for the second woman who came because he said she breathed too loud. Ruth kept her expression composed by a significant act of will. Well, she said, I'm glad I don't breathe too loud. You don't, Nora said seriously. I checked. Ruth looked at her for a moment. Then she pulled the little girl closer and pressed her lips to the top of her head and held her there, and Nora's arms came up around her waist and held on with the quiet completeness of a child who has been waiting a long time for permission to do exactly this. Ruth pressed the button in her pocket. She thought of Lucy, who had been warm and small and completely hers. She let herself feel it just for a breath, just for a second. Then she breathed out. She was still here, and tonight, Eli was riding to send a letter that Margaret had written 3 years ago, and tomorrow Cornelius Vane was going to find out that the ground beneath his claim was not as solid as he'd believed, and the day after that, something else would come, because that was the nature of a fight that mattered. But right now in this kitchen with Nora's arms around her waist and the smell of tonight's supper still in the air, and a boy upstairs who was voluntarily fixing a bucket he'd deliberately broken. Ruth Calloway felt something she had not felt in 14 months. She felt the specific, fragile, entirely unreasonable sensation of being somewhere she belonged. She did not examine it. She was not ready to examine it. She simply held it carefully, the way you hold something precious that you are afraid of dropping, and let it be true for now, without asking it to be anything more. Outside, somewhere down the south road, she could hear the sound of Eli's horse moving into the dark at a steady, purposeful pace, carrying Margaret's letter toward the justice it had been waiting 3 years to deliver. She held Nora and listened until she couldn't hear it anymore. Then she let go, gently stood up, and went to start the dishes. Tomorrow was coming, whether she was ready for it or not. She had learned in the last 14 months that tomorrow always did. Eli came back before midnight. Ruth heard the horse first, then the stable door, then his boots on the porch with that particular cadence she had learned to distinguish from Frank's and from Caleb's, and from the sound the wind made when it came off the south pasture and caught the loose board on the step. She was still at the kitchen table. She had told herself she was finishing the mending. The mending had been done for an hour. He came through the door and stopped when he saw her. "I said don't wait up," he said. "You did," she agreed. He sat down across from her. He looked like a man who had ridden hard and thought harder and had arrived somewhere he hadn't entirely planned to be. He put his hat on the table and pressed both hands flat beside it. "The lawyer has the letter," he said. "He's filing an injunction tomorrow morning to halt Vane's claim, pending review of the original survey records." He paused. "He said Margaret's documentation is the cleanest evidence he's seen in 20 years of land law. Said whoever put that letter together knew exactly what they were doing." "She knew," Ruth said. "She always knew." He said it quietly, without the scraping flatness the name usually carried. Something in how he said it had changed some of the weight, redistributed grief still there, but sitting differently. "She knew things before I figured out I needed to know them. It used to frustrate me." A pause. "I'd give anything to be frustrated by her again." Ruth looked at him across the table. She did not reach for a word to cover it. She let it stand, the way real things need to stand sometimes in the open air, without a roof over them. After a moment, Eli said, "Vane's going to find out about the injunction by morning. He's got ears in the telegraph office probably. He's going to move fast once he knows the legal ground is shifting." His jaw tightened. "I don't know yet what direction he'll move. That's what worries me." "He'll move toward the thing that hurts most," Ruth said. Eli looked at her. "That's how men like Vane operate," she said. "When the legal angle gets complicated, they find the personal one, the thing that doesn't require a judge." She held his gaze. "For you, that's the children." The silence that followed was the loudest thing in the room. Eli sat very still with his hands flat on the table and looked at her with an expression that was not the wall and was not the open face she'd seen earlier in the kitchen with Nora and Caleb. It was something between those two things, a man standing in a doorway deciding whether to come all the way in. "If he goes after custody," Eli said. The words came out like he was testing whether he could say them without something breaking. "Margaret's family in Missouri. Her aunt Clara Whitmore. Clara and we didn't end well after Margaret died. She wanted the children. I said no." His jaw worked. "She loves them. She'd do right by them. But they're mine. They're all I have left of Margaret, and I am not—" He stopped. His voice had dropped to something that was barely sound. "I am not losing them." Ruth pressed both hands flat on the table. She felt the button in her skirt pocket felt its edge. She thought about Lucy, about what it meant to love something so completely that losing it remade the entire shape of you. She thought about Eli sitting in this kitchen for 2 years, going through the mechanical motions of living, while everything that made living worth doing gathered dust in boxes upstairs. "Then we don't give him the ammunition," she said. "Vane needs this household to look like chaos. He needs you to look like a man who can't manage his own life." She kept her voice even and clear, the way she'd kept it in her teaching days when a child was frightened and needed the adult in the room to be certain, even when the adult was not entirely certain. "So we make sure that's not what anyone sees. You show up in that town, Eli. Not to argue, not to fight. You show up and you are present, and you are steady, and you let people see what this place actually is." "And what is it?" he said. She looked at him directly. "A home," she said. "It's a home where 2 children are being looked after, and a man is doing the best he can, and somebody decided to stay and help him do it." She paused. "That's not a scandal. That's just people trying to be decent to each other. and most folks in that town, if they saw it plainly, would recognize it for what it is. Eli looked at her for a long time. Not the weather assessment look from the first day. Something more careful than that. More specific. The look of a man who is trying to see something clearly, and is not entirely sure he trusts what he's seeing. "Why are you doing this?" he said. Just that.
This
Why?
story was posted on the channel The Rusty
Ruth was
Saddle.
quiet for a
Please do not
moment.
repost it in any
She
form.
thought about the answer that was easy, and the answer that was true, and the space between those two things, which was where she had been living for the last 8 days. "Because Nora fell asleep against my side tonight," she said finally. "And Caleb came in from the barn and fixed the mop bucket without being asked, and then went to bed without making a production of it." She looked at her hands on the table. "Because those children have been waiting for someone to stay, and I know what it is to wait for something that doesn't come." She looked up. "That's enough reason. That's more than enough." Eli held her gaze for a moment that stretched past the point of being comfortable and arrived somewhere more honest. Then he nodded once. He picked up his hat. He said, "Good night, Ruth," in that same way he'd said her name before, with that same specific weight, like something that had found its proper place. He went to bed. Ruth sat in the kitchen a while longer and listened to the house breathe and did not examine the feeling in her chest too carefully. She had gotten good at not examining things too carefully. She was beginning to suspect that skill was going to stop being useful very soon. Vane moved in 3 directions at once, which told Ruth he had been planning for contingencies. She found out about the first direction from Dot, who came to the ranch gate the next morning before Ruth had finished clearing breakfast. Vane had gone to the county recorder's office at first light and filed a secondary claim, a different one arguing not ownership of the water rights, but shared usage rights based on his father's historical access to the creek dating back to the 1870s. It was a weaker claim than the original, but it was faster to process, and it muddied the water legally speaking in a way that would delay any resolution by months. She found out about the second direction from Frank, who heard it from a hand on the neighboring spread. Vane had sent a telegram to Clara Whitmore in Missouri. She found out about the third direction herself, because the third direction walked through the front gate of Hargrove's Crossing on a Thursday morning and stood in the yard and waited. He was a man she didn't know, city-dressed with the careful assessing eyes of someone who was being paid to observe and report. He said his name was Mr. Delaney, and that he represented certain business interests that preferred to remain unnamed, and that he was simply in the area for professional reasons. He said all of this pleasantly standing in the yard of a ranch he had not been invited onto, looking at the house and the barn and the garden, and at Ruth, with the specific cataloging attention of someone building a document. Ruth stood on the porch and looked at him. "Mr. Delaney," she said pleasantly, "you're standing on private property without an invitation. Mr. Hargrove isn't here. I'm going to ask you to leave." Delaney smiled. It was a professional smile, the kind that didn't mean anything. "Of course, ma'am. I don't mean to intrude." He looked at the house again, a long, deliberate look. "Fine property," he said. "Shame about the legal complications." "The gate's behind you," Ruth said. He left. Ruth stood on the porch and watched him go, and understood with cold clarity that he had gotten what he came for, which was a look at the place, and possibly a look at her, and that somewhere a report was being written that would make its way to a judge's desk alongside Clara Whitmore's name and Hattie Greer's social campaign, and Vane's secondary filing, all of it building the same picture from different angles. She went inside. She picked up her coat from the hook. She walked to the south pasture. Eli saw her coming from 50 yards out. He handed his end of the wire to Frank and walked to meet her, and he read her face before she said a word the way he had gotten noticeably better at reading her face over the past 10 days. She told him about Delaney. She told him about the secondary filing. She told him about the telegram to Clara Whitmore. She told him straight, no softening, same as always. Eli listened. His face went through its sequent stillness. Comprehension contained anger, and then settled into something she had not seen before. Not the controlled face. Not the open face. Something new, a face that was done being careful, done maintaining distance from what was happening, done processing everything from behind the wall. "I should have dealt with Vane 2 years ago," he said. "You were grieving." "I was hiding," he said. "There's a difference." He looked at the south pasture at the creek he couldn't see, but could hear on a quiet day. Margaret would have dealt with him. She wouldn't have waited. She saw things like this coming a mile off, and she handled them before they got close enough to bite. He was quiet for a moment. "I let it get close enough to bite." "You're dealing with it now," Ruth said. "Because you made me." He looked at her. "I want to be clear about that. I was going to keep my head down and work the land and hope it sorted itself out. You made me look up." Ruth held his gaze. She thought about 8 days ago about a front porch and a man who had said, "You're younger than I expected," and looked at her like weather he couldn't name. She thought about how far that was from where they were standing right now, and how none of it had happened in any way she'd planned. "Clara Whitmore," she said. "You need to reach her before Vane's version of events does." Eli's jaw tightened. "Missouri's 4 days' ride." "Then you need to write a letter today and send it faster than his telegram." "And say what?" His voice had an edge to it, not at her, at the situation, at the specific trap of being a man who had refused help from someone who loved his children and now needed to ask for it. "She and I didn't end well, Ruth. I told her the children were staying with me, and I wasn't discussing it. She accepted that, or I thought she did." "She accepted it because she had no choice," Ruth said. "She's not your enemy, Eli. She loved Margaret. She wants those children to be all right. That's all she actually wants." She held his gaze. "Give her proof that they are. Write her a real letter. Tell her what this place is. Tell her what Vane is doing and why." A pause. "Invite her to come and see for herself." He stared at her. "You want me to invite her here?" "Take away Vane's weapon by making it not a weapon," Ruth said. "He's using your distance from Margaret's family as evidence that you're isolated, that the children have no real support. So stop being distant." Eli looked at the pasture. He looked at the creek. He was doing what he always did when he was deciding something, going completely still and thinking it through to the bottom before he committed. Ruth waited. She had learned that his silences were not empty, and that interrupting them cost something. "If she comes," he said finally, "and she still thinks the children should be with her, then you fight that from honesty instead of from distance," Ruth said. "But I don't think she will. I think when she sees this house, these children, she'll understand what she's actually looking at." Another long silence. The wind came off the south pasture and moved through the dry grass, and somewhere behind them, Frank was working the fence line with the steady, unhurried patience of a man who has learned not to listen to conversations that aren't his. "Will you be all right here?" Eli said. "If I'm writing letters, dealing with the lawyers, dealing with Clara, the household, the children?" "Eli," Ruth said with the same gentle exasperation she'd used before. "I have been managing this house and your children and one foreman and 2 hands and a town full of opinions for 10 days. I will be fine." Something moved across his face that was almost not quite a smile. It was the first time she'd seen anything close to one, and it lasted only a second before his face settled back into its usual gravity. But it was there, and it changed something about the whole shape of him for that 1 second. "Yeah," he said. "You will." He went back to the fence line. Ruth went back to the house. She made lunch, and she helped Nora with her reading, and she listened to Caleb explain at considerable length his theory about which horses in the stable were smarter than which other horses, and his evidence for these conclusions. She listened with full attention, because Caleb's theories deserved full attention, and because listening to him talk, now that he had decided she was worth talking to, was one of the better parts of her day. That evening after supper, Eli sat at the desk in the front room and wrote 2 letters. Ruth knew because she could hear the scratch of the pen from the kitchen where she was finishing the dishes, slow and deliberate, stopping and starting the way a man writes when he is choosing every word with care. He wrote for almost an hour. When he came through the kitchen on his way to his room, he set the sealed letters on the table. "I'll take them to the telegraph office tomorrow," he said. "First light." Ruth looked at the letters. One addressed to his lawyer in Abilene. One
This
addressed to
story
Mrs.
was posted
Clara
on the
Whitmore,
channel The Rusty
Independence,
Saddle.
Missouri.
Please do not repost it
"All right,"
in any form.
she said. He stood at the kitchen door for a moment, which she had learned meant he had something else to say, and was deciding whether to say it. She dried the last dish. She waited. "She's going to ask about you," he said. "Clara, when she writes back. She's going to want to know what you are here." Ruth set the dish on the shelf. "What are you going to tell her?" He was quiet for a long moment. He looked at the letters on the table. He looked at the lamp. He looked briefly and carefully at her. "I'm going to tell her the truth," he said. "That you came here to work and you stayed to help, and that my children sleep better since you arrived, and that this house is—" He stopped. He started again. "That this house is a home again. That's the truth, whatever else it is." He pushed off the doorframe. "Good night." He went to bed. Ruth stood in the kitchen with the lamp burning low and the letters on the table, and that feeling in her chest that she had been not examining for 11 days, sitting directly in front of her, impossible to walk around. She picked up the button from her pocket. She held it flat on her palm. She looked at it the way she looked at it when she needed to think something through to the bottom. She thought about Lucy. She let herself do it fully the way she had only let herself do it in pieces for 14 months, the whole shape of it, her daughter's weight in her arms, and the smell of her, and the sound of her voice saying, "Mama," with that complete and absolute conviction. She let herself feel the size of the loss, not as a wound she was keeping closed, but as something real and finished and true, something that had happened and could not be unchanged and did not need to be either. Lucy had been loved. Lucy would always have been loved. That did not close when other things opened. The heart, she was learning, did not work by subtraction. She thought about Nora, tucked against her side with her arms around Ruth's waist. She thought about Caleb fixing the bucket in the dark quietly without being asked, and going to bed without making a production of it. She thought about Eli standing in the doorway of his children's room, with his face open for 2 seconds, just 2 seconds looking at them, the way a man looks at the things that make him want to keep being alive. She thought about what he'd just said, that this house is a home again. She set the button down on the table beside the letters. She looked at all 3 of them together, the button and the 2 letters, the past and the present, and the thing that might be coming, and she breathed. She was still here. 12 days now, which meant she had beaten Caleb's record by 1. She would beat it by another tomorrow, and by another the day after that, until the counting stopped mattering, and the staying was simply the fact of her life. She was not ready to call it by its name, what was happening in this house. What was happening between herself and a man who wrote careful letters by lamplight and said her name like it meant something, and had smiled almost in a south pasture in the August heat. She was not ready, and she was not going to rush it, and she suspected he felt the same, that they were both still standing at the edge of something real, with the particular caution of 2 people who had been damaged by real things before, and understood exactly what they cost. But she was here, and he was here, and 2 children were sleeping upstairs in a house that had a garden coming back to life, and a mop bucket that had been repaired with care, and a photograph of a laughing woman that Nora was going to find. Ruth had already decided as soon as she could locate it in those boxes without making it seem like she had been looking. She put the button back in her pocket. She blew out the lamp. She walked to her small room and lay down on the narrow bed and looked at the ceiling. Outside, the Texas night was settling in thick and warm and full of cricket sound and the far call of something in the south pasture, and the wind was moving through the dry grass the way it always did, patient and indifferent and old as the land itself. But inside Hargrove's Crossing, something was different from how it had been 12 days ago. Ruth could feel it in the quality of the house's silence, the way a silence feels different when it has people in it who have decided without saying so to be on the same side. She closed her eyes. She pressed the button in her pocket one more time, gentle, deliberate, the way you touch something you are learning to carry differently. Then she let her hand go still and let the night take her, and for the 11th night in a row, she slept all the way through to morning. Clara Whitmore arrived on a Tuesday 9 days after Eli sent the letter. Ruth saw the hired wagon coming up the road from the kitchen window and dried her hands on her apron and went to stand on the porch, because this was the kind of moment that required someone to be standing on the porch. Eli came out from the barn. He had known she was coming. Her telegram had arrived 2 days prior. Brief and direct 3 sentences that said she was coming when she would arrive, and that she expected to see the children. No warmth in it, and no hostility either. Just the flat efficiency of a woman who had made a decision and was not interested in discussing it before she arrived. The wagon stopped at the gate. Clara Whitmore climbed down before the driver had fully set the brake, which told Ruth something immediate about her. She was 60 or near it, straight-backed, with the kind of face that had been handsome in youth, and had become something better than handsome with age. Specific lived in the face of a woman who had seen enough to have opinions and had stopped apologizing for them. She had Margaret's eyes, or rather Margaret had had hers, and seeing them in this older face was something Ruth felt in her chest before her mind had finished registering it. Clara looked at the house. She looked at the garden, which was coming back now, green in places where 3 weeks ago there had been only dry dirt and good intentions. She looked at the repaired porch railing that Caleb had worked on with Frank for 2 afternoons last week without being asked. She looked at Eli. Then she looked at Ruth. Eli opened the gate. "Clara," he said. "Eli." She said it the same way, flat, and even two people who had loved the same person and had been on opposite sides of losing her. She came through the gate and stopped in front of him, and they looked at each other for a long moment, with all of it between them, the grief and the argument and the 2 years of distance and the letter that had started all of this. "You look like you've been working," she said. "Always," he said. She looked at the house again. "The garden's better than I expected." "Ruth's been at it," Eli said. Clara's eyes moved to Ruth on the porch. She came forward and Ruth came down the steps to meet her, and they stood in the yard and looked at each other with the careful, honest attention of two women who understood that this moment mattered and that pretending it was casual would be an insult to both of them. "Mrs. Calloway," Clara said. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm glad you came." Clara looked at her steadily. "Are you?" she said. Not quite a question. "Yes," Ruth said. "Because you loved Margaret, and those children need people who love their mother. That's not a threat to anyone. That's just true." Something moved in Clara's face, a small shift. Something that had been prepared for argument, finding that there was no argument being offered. She pressed her lips together. "Where are they?" she said. "Caleb's in the barn. Nora's in the garden." Ruth paused. "She's been working at the West Row all morning. She'd want you to see it." Clara nodded once and went to find them. Eli stood beside Ruth, and they both watched her go, and neither of them said anything for a moment. "She's going to be all right," Ruth said quietly. "She came," Eli said. "I didn't know if she would." "She came because you told her the truth," Ruth said. "People generally respond to the truth when you give them the chance." He looked at her sideways. Something in the look had become familiar over the past 3 weeks, that particular angle that was more honest than his straight-on face. "You sound like you're speaking from experience," he said. 14 months of it," Ruth said. He didn't ask what she meant. She thought he understood or was beginning to. She went inside to put the kettle on and left him standing in the yard, watching the woman who had been Margaret's family walk toward the garden, where his daughter was kneeling in the dirt, trying to coax something back to life. Clara stayed 2 days. Ruth gave her the spare room and made her meals, and answered her questions with the same direct honesty she'd brought to every difficult conversation in this house. Clara had questions. She asked them the way a woman asks, when she is trying to be fair, when she came in prepared to distrust, but is finding the evidence running against her preparation. On the second morning, they sat at the kitchen table over coffee, while Eli and the children were out in the paddock, and Clara folded her hands and said, "I owe you an apology, Mrs. Calloway." "You don't," Ruth said. "I do. I received a letter from Cornelius Vane before Eli's arrived. He told me the ranch was failing, and the children were being neglected, and that a woman of uncertain background was living in the house." She looked at her coffee. "I believed him because I was afraid. Because I've been afraid for 2 years that Eli's grief was swallowing those children whole, and nobody was watching." She looked up. "This is not a neglected house. Those are not lost children." "No," Ruth agreed. "They're not." Clara was quiet for a moment. "Caleb showed me his snake collection yesterday," she said. "He has 4 of them in separate enclosures in the barn. He has names for all of them, and a theory about their individual personalities." Ruth kept her expression carefully composed. "He also told me," Clara continued, "that you know the difference between a rat snake
This
and a
story
corn
was
snake
posted on
by
the
shape
channel
of
The
head,
Rusty Saddle.
and that this
Please do not
information
repost
impressed
it in
him
any form.
considerably." A pause. "He doesn't impress easily." "I'm aware," Ruth said. "Nora showed me every plant in that garden and told me which ones were there when her mother had it and which ones Ruth put in." Clara paused on the name. "She said Ruth, not Mrs. Calloway. Ruth." She looked at her coffee cup. "Margaret would have chosen someone exactly like you if she could have chosen. She had a gift for knowing who was real." Her voice had gone quiet around the edges. "I see what you're doing for this family, Mrs. Calloway. I see it plainly." Ruth looked at her directly. "I'm not their mother. I'm not trying to be. Margaret is their mother, and she always will be." She paused. "But I love them. And I'm here. And I'm not leaving. Whatever else comes next, that part is true." Clara studied her for a long moment with those eyes that were Margaret's eyes in an older face. Then she nodded slow and certain. "She would have chosen you," she said again. "I'm sure of it." She looked out the window toward the paddock where they could hear Caleb's voice carrying, explaining something to his father with great conviction, and Nora's quieter sound underneath it. Clara pressed her hand over her mouth for a moment. Just a moment. Then she straightened and picked up her coffee cup. "I want to visit," she said. "Twice a year if you'll have me. I want to know them as they grow." "Your family," Ruth said simply. "You don't need permission." Clara left that afternoon. She embraced both children for a long time, Caleb with his arms loose and then tightening by degrees, as he remembered he had decided to allow this Nora with her whole self completely, the way she did everything once she'd made up her mind. Clara shook Eli's hand and then changed her mind and embraced him, too brief and fierce. 2 people who had been on opposite sides of a grief and had just found each other on the same one. She took both of Ruth's hands in hers before she climbed into the hired wagon. She squeezed them once and did not say anything, and did not need to. Ruth stood with Eli and the children and watched the wagon go down the road until it was dusk, and then nothing, and the 4 of them stood there in the late afternoon quiet for a moment before Caleb said, "She smells like Margaret." In a voice stripped entirely of its armor, just a boy saying a true thing, and Nora slipped her hand into Ruth's without looking up and held on. The hearing was 6 days later. Ruth did not go. She stayed at the ranch with the children and let the men handle what the men needed to handle, because she understood that some battles are won before they reach the courtroom, and this one had been won in the moment Margaret put pen to paper 3 years ago, and trusted that the truth she was writing down would find the right hands at the right time. It had. And that was enough. She knew it was over before Eli came home, because Frank rode back first, and tied his horse at the post with the particular deliberateness of a man who has good news, and is waiting for the right person to deliver it. Ruth kept the children busy. She made supper. She set the table. She waited. Eli rode up at 4 in the afternoon, 2 hours earlier than she'd expected, and came directly to the garden where she was working the west row with her hands in the dirt and her back to the road. She heard his horse, heard him in the stable, heard his boots on the path, and she sat back on her heels and looked up at his face. It was the open face. All the way open, the wall entirely down, and what was underneath was something so large and real and undefended that she felt the size of it from 6 feet away. "It's done," he said. Ruth exhaled everything she had been holding for 3 weeks. "The secondary claim failed," he said. "The judge threw it out inside an hour. Margaret's letter combined with the original survey records established clear title beyond any reasonable dispute." He stopped. His voice had something in it that was not quite steady, the sound of a man saying words that are carrying more weight than words usually carry. "The south boundary is ours. The creek is ours. All of it. Vane is facing charges for filing a fraudulent claim and for the original deed fabrication." "Good," Ruth said. Her voice wasn't entirely steady either. Eli stood in front of her in the garden his wife had planted and looked at her with that full, open face and said, "Your Margaret saved this ranch." "She saved it for you," Ruth said. "She was paying attention when it mattered. She always was." He looked at her for a long moment. He reached down and took her hand and helped her to her feet, which he had never done before. A small, simple gesture that landed with all the weight of what it actually was. He kept her hand in his for a moment after she was standing. His hand was rough and warm and entirely certain. He let go. He went inside to tell the children. Ruth stood in the garden and pressed both palms flat against her thighs and breathed the way she had breathed that first evening on the narrow bed in her small room, slow and deliberate and taking stock. She was still here. 23 days now. She had stopped counting somewhere around day 15, which she thought meant something, though she had not yet decided exactly what. That evening after supper, after the children were in bed, Eli came to find her. She was on the porch in the last of the light, sitting on the step, the way she had taken to doing in the evenings, listening to the sound the south pasture made when the day was cooling. She heard the door open behind her and felt him there, before he sat down on the step beside her, close enough that his arm was almost against hers. They sat in silence for a while. The comfortable kind. The kind that had taken 3 weeks to build and was worth every day of building it. "I want to say something," Eli said. Ruth waited. He looked at the south pasture. He looked at his hands. He looked at the place where the creek was invisible in the settling dark, but present, running permanent now in a way it hadn't been 3 weeks ago. "When Margaret died," he said, "I decided I was done, not with living, just with the rest of it, the part that requires you to let people in." He paused. Seemed like the sensible thing. If nobody gets close enough to matter, nobody can leave. "I understand that," Ruth said quietly. "I know you do." He turned to look at her. "I know because you were doing the same thing when you stepped off that stage. You were here to disappear Ruth. You were doing everything right and feeling as little as you could manage and trying to make yourself into something useful and invisible." He held her gaze. "And then you stayed. You. And my daughter started sleeping through the night. And my son fixed a bucket he'd broken on purpose and acted like it was nothing. And I started—" He stopped, started again. "I started remembering what a house is supposed to feel like when someone in it has decided to stay." Ruth looked at him. Her eyes were burning. She did not look away. "I don't have pretty words," he said. "I never did. Margaret used to say I spoke in fence posts, all function and no decoration." Something moved in his face. Grief and affection mixed together so completely, they were indistinguishable. "But I can tell you plainly what I know. I know this ranch is whole again because of you. I know my children are whole again because of you. I know that I—" He stopped, breathed, made himself say it. "I know that I am less lost than I have been in 2 years, and that is because of you, and I am not a man who says things like that which should tell you how true it is." Ruth pressed her lips together hard. Eli reached into his coat pocket. He held something out on his palm. Small and plain, a ring of dark silver, simple as a statement of fact. "This was my grandmother's," he said. "She was a practical woman who wore practical things, and lasted 60 years in this country, through conditions that would have finished most people." He paused. "It suits you better than anything I could have chosen." Ruth looked at the ring. She looked at his face. She looked at the full weight of what was being offered, not a fairy tale, not a grand romantic gesture, but something heavier and more real than either of those things. A man who had rebuilt himself from the ground up, holding out his hand and asking her to do the same. A family that had already, without anyone planning it, become hers. She thought about Lucy. She took the button from her pocket and held it in her other hand, flat on her palm, looking at both things at once, the old and the new, the loss and the living. Lucy had been loved. Lucy would always have been loved. That didn't close when Ruth, when love opened again. The heart did not work by subtraction. She knew that now with the settled certainty of someone who has learned a thing not from being told it, but from living it all the way through. She put the button back in her pocket. She took the ring from Eli's palm. "Yes," she said. The back door flew open. Caleb came out onto the porch with the barely contained energy of a boy who has been listening through a window and has opinions about what he has heard. Nora was right behind him, smaller and quieter, but her eyes were very bright. She said yes, Caleb demanded. Eli turned. "Caleb," he said with great patience. "Were you listening at the window?" "The window was open," Caleb said. "I didn't open it." "That is not the same thing." "Papa." Nora stepped forward straight-backed and solemn, with the dignity of a 7-year-old who has decided to be the reasonable one. "Did she say yes or not?" Ruth held up her hand. The ring was on her finger, plain and silver and entirely right. Caleb made a sound of pure triumph that sent 2 birds off the fence rail into the dark. Nora looked at the ring, and then looked at Ruth, and then with a composure that lasted approximately 3 seconds, crossed the porch in 4 steps and put both arms around Ruth's waist and held on with everything she had. Ruth held her back. Her throat was doing something she was not going to apologize for. Caleb stood on the top step with his arms crossed, affecting the expression of a boy who is too old to be emotional about things, and said, "I knew it. I called it 2 weeks ago. Frank owes me a nickel." "You made a bet with Frank," Eli said. "He started it," Caleb said. Eli looked at his son with the expression of a man who cannot decide whether to be exasperated or proud, and is landing somewhere between both. He put his hand on the back of Caleb's neck, the way he'd done in the kitchen the night of Margaret's letter, rough and certain, and full of everything he didn't say. Caleb leaned into it with the carefully nonchalant posture of a boy who was absolutely leaning into it. The 4 of them stood on the porch of Hargrove's Crossing in the last of the summer evening, and the creek ran on the south boundary, and the horses moved in the paddock, and the garden Margaret had planted and Ruth had coaxed back to life bloomed in the late heat with a stubbornness that felt deliberate. Eli stepped close to Ruth. He put his hand against her face, his thumb moving once across her cheekbone, slow and certain, the gesture of a man who has decided to stop being careful about what he wants. She looked up at him. "Ruth Calloway," he said. Just her name. The way a man says the name of the thing he has decided to keep. "Eli Hargrove," she said back. He kissed her. It was not a dramatic kiss. It was quiet and real and certain, built out of 23 days of hard things and small things and the daily unremarkable work of 2 people deciding without ever quite saying so to be on the same side. It tasted like all of that, and it was worth every day of it. Caleb made a loud noise of theatrical disgust. Nora elbowed him. They pulled apart, and Ruth looked over Eli's shoulder at the 2 children on the porch, Caleb with his arms crossed in performative objection, and Nora with her quiet, settled expression of someone who has watched something come right and is entirely at peace with it. Ruth reached into her pocket. She took out Lucy's button, that small brass circle she had carried for 14 months, like a wound she was keeping open, because she had believed for a long time that grief was the only honest way to love what you had lost. She held it in her palm for a moment. She looked at it the way you look at something you have been carrying for so long it has become part of the shape of your hand. She walked to the porch railing. The garden was below the west row she and Nora had worked together, the plants coming up green and stubborn through the Texas soil. She held the button over it. She let it go. It fell into the earth among the living things and disappeared. Nora looked at the place where it had landed. She looked up at Ruth. She didn't ask. She understood the way children sometimes understand the things that matter most completely, and without needing them explained. She reached up and took Ruth's hand, not asking, not testing, not calculating the odds of whether she was allowed. Just taking it certain and calm, the way she'd done in the shed the night of the storm, the night everything between all of them had changed. Caleb looked at his sister's hand in Ruth's. He looked at his father standing beside her. He looked at the garden, and the darkening sky, and the south pasture, where the creek ran permanent and uncontested through land that was theirs. His scowl, that 10-year-old armor he had worn every day of the 23 days she'd been here, settled finally into something else. Something younger than the scowl and older than 10, the expression of a boy who has decided after careful and exhaustive deliberation that the thing in front of him is real and can be trusted. He came to stand on Ruth's other side. He did not take her hand. He was 10 years old, and he had a reputation to maintain. But his shoulder pressed against her arm, solid and deliberate, and entirely on purpose, and he stayed there. Eli looked at all of them. His family rearranged by grief and stubbornness, and a woman who had stepped off a stage in Caldwell Wells with one bag and a brass button, and nothing left to lose, and had proceeded to give everything she had anyway. His face in the last of the light was open and unguarded, and full of something that was not less for having come late, was not smaller for having been earned inch by inch through the hardest possible way. He put his arm around Ruth's shoulders. She leaned into him slightly, just slightly, the way you lean into something when you have decided it will hold. The four of them stood on the porch of Hargrove's Crossing as the summer dark came down warm and full around them, and the crickets started their steady sound, and somewhere out on the south pasture a horse called once into the night and was answered by another, and the creek ran on past the repaired fence line and the garden coming back to life, and Ruth Calloway pressed her free hand against her side, where Lucy's button had been for 14 months, and felt for the first time since October of last year the particular lightness of a hand that has set something down. She had come to Red Bluff County to disappear. She had arrived with one bag, a dead child's button, and the grief she had been feeding for 14 months, because grief had been the only honest thing she had left. She had come to be nothing, to be useful and invisible and empty of wanting. Instead, she had walked into a house full of broken things and begun without ever quite deciding to the long and daily work of holding them together. A boy who needed someone to take him seriously. A girl who needed permission to take up space. A man who needed someone to make him look up from the ground he'd been staring at for 2 years. And somewhere in the doing of all of it, in the ordinary and unremarkable and entirely unglamorous work of showing up every single day, she had found the thing she had not known she was looking for. Not a replacement, not a second chance, something entirely its own, something that had her name on it and had been waiting with the patience of the country itself at the end of a road she had taken in pure desperation. She had come to Redwood Valley, to Red Bluff County, to Hargrove's Crossing, to this porch, to these people, to disappear. She had become instead exactly what this family needed. And they had become, without anyone planning it, without anyone asking for it, without anyone being ready for it, exactly what she needed too. And that, all of it, every hard-won inch of it, was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.